all, I'm DYuanna Allen Robb. You're welcome to call me D. Everybody say hi, Miss D. Hi, okay, thanks for making me feel welcome. I direct our Division of Maternal, Child, and Adolescent Health Programs here at the Health Department. Lots of different programs that focus on the health and well-being of moms and children and families and high school students and everybody in Metro Nashville Public Schools. So thank you for having me here. So we're going to start first with this whole concept of socialization. What I want you to know about the cycle of socialization is that everybody goes through this process. So say that. Everybody goes through this process. Everybody go. I went through this, you went through it, she went through it, she went through it, he went through it. We all go through this process, okay? It starts from the day that we are born. So a sperm and an egg got together and, 9 months later, we popped out, right? However that happened, we were born. The first thing that happens whenever we are born, we are ascribed an identity from the moment that we are born, actually before we're born, right? The first ultrasound that indicates a gender. Do you have a penis or not a penis, right? We are ascribed an identity. Does that make sense? So we knew that you were a girl, and we knew that Dwayne, or Mr. Holman, was a boy. Those are very much ideals or values that are placed on gender in our society, right? But as a baby, we don't have any information about how the world works. We don't have any information about anything other than what we are taught, right? Because we don't come into the world with all this infinite wisdom and we know more than the parents or the people around us. But it starts here. We're ascribed an identity. The identity is usually around gender, and the identity is usually around the phenotypic expression of how much melanin we have in our skin, right? So we call that ends up being called race, basically. Those are the two things that are very prominent on your birth certificate. That's the first place where your identity is determined. It's ascribed to you. Okay? When you're born, all of these things are already in place. So, cycle of socialization starts when you're born. You get an identity. Somebody tells you who you are from the moment that you were born, usually by your gender and by your race. Make sense? Okay. Your first socialization is taught on a very personal level. This usually happens by your parents. This happens usually by your teachers. This is where the norms, your values, and the expectations that the people in your personal circle, again, usually parents, teachers, your relatives, that they start to place on you. So if there's an expectation in my household when I was growing up that we sit down at the kitchen table and we eat dinner together every night at 6 o'clock because it's very important that we talk to each other as a family. That's a value that starts to be placed on us from the time that we're very small children, right? This is also a place where you'll see things like we start to hear things around what are the expectations of girls versus the expectation of boys. Can you give me an example of what that might look like if we're talking about a little child, a little girl or a little boy?
I think girls have been taught to ascribe to marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and boys maybe with their money and job.
Traditional gender roles. Traditional because we're socialized. This is what traditional means. It's how we are socialized in this way, right? So for a child, if you have a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, you may not necessarily be telling your 2-year-old or 3-year-old, if you're a girl, you got to grow up and you got to get married, and a boy, you got to go make lots of money. But what you might see is we encourage girls to play with baby dolls, right? And we discourage boys from playing with baby dolls in our Western culture, right? If you play with baby dolls, it might mean you're a little feminine, right? And we don't want boys to be feminine in our culture. That's not a part of that socialization that we want to see. So our parents and our teachers, our relatives, our first kind of socialization happens when we're very young, typically by the adults who are in our lives, okay? These ideas that happen during the first socialization are reinforced. When we start to interact with institutions and we start to interact with the culture and the neighborhood and the people outside of our immediate family, these same ideas get reinforced. They get reinforced particularly in the media, and by media, that's huge, right? Children's books. If they're depicting a boy in a children's book, you don't typically see children's book with boys playing with dolls. So if your mom told you girls play with baby dolls and you've gotten a baby doll and oh, you're supposed to rock the baby doll to sleep and put her down, and she's going to read you a children's book, it's probably going to have a picture of a little girl with the doll or in a very nurturing or kind of caring kind of role, and a little boy's going to have something like with a truck in it, right? These same ideas, they're, media, so print media, what you hear on the radio, but really, really crucial is what you see on television, right? So those same kind of gender roles, as you have said, they're reinforced in our institutions. It's reinforced in culture. In our education system, this gets reinforced, let's say, through, in the classroom setting, right? You might have more intention that's paid to boys around math and science because we believe that, boys are better at math and science than girls are. That's not necessarily true. There's no biological difference. If I were to dissect the brain of a girl versus the brain of a boy, there's not any real clear difference between, this boy over here, he's definitely better at math and science. But this is the way that these ideas get reinforced. This makes sense? So once they are reinforced, right, in our institutions and in our culture, they get enforced. These are where kind of laws or rituals or practices come into play, right? So they get reinforced through rewards and punishments, okay? So think about it. If you're at your high school, we have been socialized that girls use the girls' bathroom and boys use the boys' bathroom. What would happen to you at HimFog if you went into the boys' bathroom to use the restroom?
We'd get in trouble.
You would get in trouble. That's an example in our system of rewards and punishment to reinforce these ideas in our institutions and our culture by the way that we've been socialized that started from the day we were born. Make sense? Can you think of another example?
Pay, like women getting paid less.
Women getting paid less. Where did you hear that?
It's the reality.
It is? How so?
Doing the same job as women, with the same job, they'll still get paid less than a man will.
Why is that? Don't know.
I guess a woman can be a burden if they're like, because they usually, traditionally, women, family life and job doesn't seem to really mesh, so maybe them having children, getting pregnant, maternity leave, things like that.
Oh, that's a really great example. That there is now a system that is set up to punish family, right? So for a woman, this idea that it's your job to take care of children. Men don't get pregnant and deliver babies. Women do. That's a function of our biology of having an X and a Y chromosome. But our labor market, our employment system sets up a system of punishment, right? If I become pregnant and I have to take maternity leave, and so I may be seen as a burden to the company because I'm not here, or we can't be as productive, and so there may be this attitude of why even pay women or promote women in higher positions of leadership and responsibility if they're not going to be here anyway, right? Okay, so ideas are reinforced in our institutions and culture, and it sets up a system of enforcement where you can see clear rewards and clear punishments for things. It also sets up this place of privilege, right? So this whole kind of concept of privilege being, there are certain things that some people earn that they really didn't, or there are certain things that people get that they really didn't earn, right? So in the case of kind of gender pay equality, if Dwayne is as equally qualified for a job as I am, right, and he has the same amount of years of experience as I do, and we went to the best schools, and we got the same degree, and we're like, literally, we're like 1-1, neck and neck. Chances are DYuanna will probably get the job, and not only will he get the job, he will make more money than me. That's an example of an unearned privilege that he gets because he happens to have what? A Y chromosome. Yeah, he just happens to have a Y chromosome. And he happens to look like what we have ascribed from the day that he was born of what we define as a man. Okay, so lots of different intersections here. So let's move on. When we have this system of enforcement, we can see very clear rewards and punishment. We can see a system of privilege. There can also have a system of stigma. Where can you think an example of where there might be a stigma associated with a certain identity? I'm going to pick on you because you haven't said anything yet.
I was thinking like with sexual orientation.
Yes.
Stigma.
Yes. If DYuanna happened to have an earring in his ear, if he happened to have what we would consider more feminine qualities, and you can just, you can think about images maybe that you've seen on television where men who have appear to have more feminine qualities, there's a stigma that's associated with that because that's not a part of how we have socialized and what we think and how we have reinforced this idea of what a man is. Okay? So it sets up this system of stigma also. The results of this cycle of socialization are the majority of us are pretty ignorant, right? So if this is what you have been taught, this is what you've been told from the day you were born, this is what you've been taught by your family, the people who love you, and you love them, and why would they tell you something wrong? You don't even question it, right? These ideas have been reinforced in our institutions and in our culture. We can see that there's clear rewards and there's clear punishments. When you don't follow the rules, you get punished. When you do follow the rules, you get rewards. The results of this is that many of us don't even question this process or even know that this process exists. But I said from the beginning, we've all gone through this. We all have, you can't escape this process. We've all gone through this. The other thing that starts to happen is that we start to dehumanize people. So when you have large groups, particularly groups that are stigmatized, you start to dehumanize them. It's the gays, or it's the blacks, or it's the, it's the women. They don't really, it's their job to go have the babies and stay at home. We start to lump people into entire groups, and we don't pay attention to the fact that they are a human being just like the rest of us are, okay? There's also this thing of internalized patterns of power. And so as a part of this cycle of socialization, if I'm an individual or I belong to a group that is receiving unearned privilege just because this process exists, I can start to internalize that I am more powerful or I am more valuable than you, which is not true, but it's how it continues to get reinforced, okay? So this is what happens. We all pretty much lose in this process of cycle of socialization, okay? Once this cycle gets started, you see that it doesn't end. The circle is continuous. It just keeps repeating itself. And we have two choices, basically. When we understand the cycle of socialization, we have a choice. We can either do nothing and perpetuate the cycle when we become parents or whenever we're around other children and their ascribed identity. We can promote the status quo. We can say, oh my gosh, it's too hard. If this thing is continuous and it's not ending, then it's too hard to try to address all of these different things. So we just say, you know what? Somebody else will fix it one day. I'm just going to put my head down and keep on going, right? Or we have this opportunity to do something else. There is a direction for change. What are some of the things that you think that we can do to kind of change this cycle of socialization? You want to, yeah, or she can grab a marker, either one.
If y'all want to get involved, I would
Yes.
grab a marker.
So one of the things that I'm doing, right? So I question the things that I was taught and how they've been reinforced in my interactions in institutions and in media and in culture, right? I'm choosing to educate other people, young people such as yourself, brilliant young people such as yourself, about this cycle of socialization. And I also choose to reframe some of the stigma that might be associated, that other people associate with what it means to be a black woman. I'm reframing that in how I live my life and what the things that I say about myself and the things that I say about other women of color. What do you think are some things that we can do to change this cycle? And I've left a little space there, and you can write anywhere on here. What do you think? There's no wrong answer. So just get to writing. Go ahead. It's okay. Anything. The interesting thing about this cycle of socialization is it really starts, so kind of that purple triangle in the middle of the page that's a little lopsided, is that the cycle is really generated from a place of fear. It's generated from a place of ignorance, and it's generated from a place of insecurity, right? So you heard Dr. Alexander when she was talking about things that we can do. And so there's this idea that if I'm trying to achieve equality, so I'm trying to make everybody equal, then the way for me to do that is I have to take something away from you and give it to this group over here to make that equality happen. That is a very common fear that people have. Nobody likes to have things taken away from them, right? Especially if you think, oh, I worked really hard to get where I am. I worked 60 hours a week to create this kind of wealth opportunity for my family. And now you want to tax me, another 30% to help poor people get out of poverty. That's not fair. Don't take stuff away from me that I've worked hard for. It also comes from the place of ignorance, right? So I may not know a whole lot about cultural groups that are different from me, right? If I may not know a whole lot about individuals that identify of like an Arabic descent, right? That identify as being Arabic. I may have this idea in my mind based on what's been reinforced in the media about individuals who identify as Arabic, but that comes from a place of ignorance. It also comes from a place of insecurity, because if I'm benefiting from a privilege that I really didn't earn, right, then I might also say, well, if I start to question, am I really like that great, and like, am I really that powerful? And somebody who looks different from me, who actually is as qualified as I am, or might even be more qualified than me, who's also competing with me for the same job, I might feel a little bit more insecure about that. And it forces me to want to hold this cycle in place that much more. Does that make sense? It's this really crazy thing of human fear, right? The thing is that everybody in this room, like in terms of our genome, we're pretty much the same, right? We're pretty much the same. What actually separates us in all of our differences in Western culture is this cycle, okay? So both of you all have markers in your hand, and you happen to be standing over there. So we're just going to move right into the cycle of socialization. Sets up this dominant versus non-dominant culture, kind of this idea around dominant, non-dominant culture. And how it plays out, and I think you all have clearly acknowledged this already, that we can see how these ideas are kind of reinforced in our society. These ideas, we can name them actually. If I ask a question, you can say, oh yeah, well, girls don't play with, boys don't play with dolls, girls are not encouraged to play with trucks, girls are encouraged to go into caregiver professions or to stay at home and take care of the children, and men are really encouraged to be the primary income earner and, to move into these kind of leadership positions. Pretty well documented. The other thing about socialization, like we've said, it's pervasive. So it's everywhere in our culture. Everywhere you look, this cycle is reinforced. It's reinforced on a very conscious level, and then it's also reinforced on a very unconscious level. Because it's so pervasive, it just becomes a part. It's like breathing air. Most of us don't think about every time we take a breath. It's just something that we do naturally. The same kind of concepts in our cycle of socialization are just like breathing air. It's just something natural because we were born and this is how we were raised, and then that gets reinforced over here, and we see the system of rewards and punishment and stigma and privilege, okay? I have a $10 iTunes gift card in my pocket. Who has an iPhone? Ah, too bad. All right. Dwayne does. Okay. All right. So for my first exercise with you all, before we go back over there to the board, on the next slide, I want you, Priya, right? Yes. I want you to try to read. I want you to name the colors that you see on the screen as fast as you can.
The letters or the colors?
The colors. I want you to name the colors that you see as fast as you can. Are you ready?
Okay.
Ready?
All right.
Set, go.
Green, red, black, blue, purple, red, black, red, yellow, yellow, green, blue, blue, orange.
You're too slow. All right, Dwayne, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, I want you to name the colors that you see on the screen. And go.
What did you say?
Name the colors that you see on the screen.
Name the colors.
Name the colors you see on as fast as you can.
Name the colors, not
Na-
the color themselves.
Name the colors that you see on the screen.
Red, blue, white, yellow, blue, green, red, purple.
No, you already messed up.
Yeah.
Right, so this is an example. This really has to do more with neuroscience, and we can talk about it later if you want to. But this is kind of like this cycle of socialization is our brains have been trained to read words faster and process that information because of linguistics and the way that we're trained in our alphabet here in Western culture, faster than we process information about color. So trying to read this as fast as you can, your brain automatically reads the words first and not the colors, right? And this is a very common experiment that's done in psychology classes when you get to college and even in high school in some cases. But it's a simplistic way, but it kind of helps to illustrate that on an unconscious level, we perpetuate this cycle in our everyday life. And you have to be really, really conscious and really, really attuned. The same way that you have to be really, really conscious and really, really attuned to try to get through this exercise, to reprogram your brain to process information differently. Make sense? Excellent. All right, so let's talk about dominant culture. You all are already at the board. The cycle of socialization sets up these groups of dominant versus non-dominant culture, right? So dominant culture is for the most part the shared values or the shared norms or the shared expectations or the shared rules that we expect people to follow or that are placed on us. The dominant culture, these values or these ideas are usually set by the population that is in the majority. So if you think about the founding of this country, the United States, who was the majority population when this country was founded? White men. It makes perfect sense. Everywhere I look, I see people who look like me, right? And so if I'm creating a country and I kind of want things to continue to go my way because it's my country, I'm going to set this system up to ensure that there's still dominance through control. And we control things with laws, with policies, with institutions, how they function, all of those kinds of things, right? The language, the religion, the values, the rituals, the social customs, all of those things are wrapped up in this kind of concept of dominant culture. So if we're talking about gender, male or female, who is the dominant group in terms of male or female? Male. So will one of you write that up there? And big, yeah. Who's the non-dominant group? Female. When it comes to sexual orientation, who's the dominant group? Heterosexual. We'll use that term because straight might mean something different to somebody else. And who's the non-dominant group when it comes to sexual orientation? Everybody else, right? Yes. LGBTQIA, but anyone who doesn't identify as heterosexual is not in that dominant group. What about age?
The youth, the middle youth.
Yeah, the middle, not us, but like not too young and not too old.
That would be us, right, Dwayne? Would that be us? So, yeah, okay, so individuals who are middle age. And what would you all say that age range is from your perspective? Who would you consider to be middle age in our country? 30s, 40s.
Career,
People in their career. 30s, 40s, 50s? Is that a good one? Yeah, okay, yeah, okay, good. Okay, so yeah, we're in the dominant culture. Okay, so as you define it, middle-aged people, 30 to 50 years of age, right? Okay, and who's in the non-dominant group?
the elderly and the young.
Elderly and the young. Okay. In particular, there is more stigma around individuals who are young and individuals who are older. Yes. When it comes to ability, so able-bodied individuals, who is the dominant versus the non-dominant culture?
Like someone who doesn't have a disability.
Somebody that doesn't have a disability, right? So in this case, we would just say able individuals. And who's the non-dominant group? Somebody who has a disability. And when it comes to race, who's the dominant group? Yeah. And who's the non-dominant group? Non-white people. Everybody else. Religion.
Christian? In our Western.
In our Western culture. Do you agree? Okay. And in particular, I'll take it one step further, Protestant Christian. That's okay. Spelling doesn't count when you're at the board. It's totally okay, I promise. And who's the non-dominant group?
Yeah.
So there's a particular stigma around Islamic religious practices, but you're right. Basically, anybody who identifies as non-Protestant Christian. And you all understand why I'm making the distinction with Protestant Christian in particular? Because it is the majority. There's Catholicism, which is also in Christianity, but it's not the same thing as Protestant Christianity. And there's also, yeah. Okay, so yeah, there's a bunch. But in our country, and I raised that point because one of our presidents, John F. Kennedy, he was Catholic. And there was a lot of concern about a Catholic president. Why do you think?
He's not dominant.
Because that's not what the dominant religious practice was in our country in the 60s. Right. It's a stigma. If you're not Protestant Christian, there's a stigma behind. And well, there's a stigma in particular around now Islamic culture in our Islamic practice, religious practices. In the 60s, there was just the stigma around being Catholic. Maybe not as much now, or not. Okay. Income. So your socioeconomic status. Who's the dominant culture there?
The middle class.
You think so? I don't know. I'm asking because this is your perspective and what you see.
I think most people are in the middle class.
I think that too, but then I don't think like who has like
The
more
power
power.
would be the
It seems like a big deal.
Do you all agree? I'm going to go to the the dominant cultural group, when it comes to income, there's a question around wealthy people seem to have more power, but there seems to be more people who are in the middle class. All right, you two decide. What do you think? What do you want to put there? Wealthy? Okay, we'll put wealthy there. And who's non-dominant in that group? There's a particular stigma around being in poverty, yes. And then everybody else is not wealthy. Everybody else is not wealthy. Mm-hmm.
There's like a pattern here.
Really? You see a pattern there? All right. Language. What is the dominant language? English. And what's the non-dominant group?
Everyone else?
Everybody else that doesn't speak English as their first language. And then for nationality, I know. What do I mean by that? What do you think I mean by nationality? Yeah, your country of origin.
American would be that one.
Ding, 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 ding. Yes, it would be. Right? So if you were born in the United States, you're more likely to be a part of it. There's a dominant culture for, everybody else, for our cycle of socialization. Now, Priya, you said you're noticing a pattern here. What's the pattern that you notice?
Well, there's usually one group who's dominant, and then everyone else seems to below them.
Yeah. And so if you were to describe the dominant culture in the United States, who would be in that group?
So, heterosexual white males who are between the ages of 30 and 50, who are Protestant Christian, they're wealthy, they speak English as their first language, and they're American.
Does that sound about right with your experience and what you see on television and what you hear in the news and
Our president.
our president? Yeah,
Everything but age.
you think he fits every? Yeah, exactly. He fits every category except for age. Yes. So we laugh, and that was, thank you, Dwayne. Thank you for that we laugh, but this pattern has existed for a very long time. For a very, very long time. Okay? Does this make sense to you all? Does this resonate with what you kind of your sense of reality and how you function in the world? That this is about right. So what we're doing is we're naming, right? We're being very clear how this cycle of socialization has set up these different groups. All right? That's all we're really doing. It's like, okay, I'm really clear how the cycle of socialization really reinforces what we understand as the dominant culture in our country. And the purpose of the cycle of socialization is to keep this dominant culture in place. Because if I'm in the dominant culture and I am benefiting from a privilege that I didn't necessarily earn, or I might have earned, but for the most part I didn't earn, I would like to keep that going because I want to pass that on to my children. I want to pass that on to my grandchildren. Does that make sense, right? We want to continue to benefit. What else do you notice about this dominant versus non-dominant kind of culture groups?
Maybe it's a global thing too. Doesn't have to do with Western, maybe.
It could be. Yes, it can definitely be a global thing, and it's a global thing. You can see a very similar pattern as a result of colonization. So any area in the world that has been colonized, you'll see something similar, right? Does anything else stand out to you about these dominant versus non-dominant kind of groups? one of the things that stands out for me is that when I look at these different groups, we can belong to more than one, right? There are some categories in which we might identify as a part of the dominant culture, and therefore we receive a privilege because we identify in that particular cultural aspect of our how we've been socialized. And then there's other categories that we don't identify in, right? So it sets up this really interesting thing around intersectionality. I'm not going to go into a whole conversation. As Dwayne turns the camera back over here, I'm not going to go into a big conversation about intersectionality. But what I want you to walk away with today, before we move into our next exercise, is that when you're thinking about capturing experiences with your camera, when you're thinking about what does inequity and equity look like, it doesn't necessarily look exactly the same in each one of these categories, because you as an individual can identify in more than one category in terms of being dominant or non-dominant. Does that make sense? So it's a little more complex. It's not as simple as saying, if we do this, then it will fix this, because we all identify somewhere in this area of intersectionality. And to the point around age, we will all kind of identify, if we live long enough, we'll move into kind of that bell curve of what our country and what we're socialized to believe is the workforce and the competent workforce. We don't think that young people are competent and can do good work because we don't think you're responsible. That's the way we've been socialized. That's not how I personally feel about you all, but I'm just saying that's how we've been socialized. We don't think that individuals who are over the age of 60 are competent members of our workforce because they're old. They don't move as fast. They're not as motivated to do things. So we will move in and out of these categories. Age is a particular one where we might move in and out. But for the most part, the phenotypic expression of our race, which means how much melanin is in our skin, can't really change that part. And unfortunately, it's the thing that people see, right? How we express our sexual orientation or how we express our gender might be mutable, right? Means that I could modify how I look, or there's things that I can do to identify along a gender spectrum. And you may not know if I'm male or female or whatever. But again, this happens to be the thing that most people see, that we really can't change, which is why the conversation about race, in my opinion, is such an important one, because out of all of these, it's the one that's the hardest to change because it's what people visually see, right? Okay, Anka? Annika? Annika, thank you. Will you take that piece of flip chart paper down and just move it to the side to reveal the one underneath? Thank you. All right, so we have some cards over here on the table, and I'll just ask, we'll jump in together, we can do this together. Want us to think a little bit about, now that we have a good sense of what dominant groups are and non-dominant groups are, what's the impact of being in these gender, or it's not the gender, what's the impact of being in these kind of dominant versus non-dominant categories, right? And how do they manifest in really practical ways? So one, we've already talked about women earning less money than men. When women are in the non-dominant category, it's just this thing because we believe that men are just more competent than women, and that gets reinforced by how much money we offer women, what type of jobs we prepare them for, the career paths that we put them on, okay? You get the kind of idea. You're gonna look at the card, the index card. There can be more than one index card per category of impact, but as best you can, if you want to grab a piece of tape, slap it on the back of the index card and put it kind of where you think it goes in terms of what is the impact? What difference does it make being in a non-dominant group? Okay? I'm going to give you about 3 minutes, and your time starts now. Go. what is the impact of, why did you place these two note cards there?
I think in, I guess, global society, there's only really two main genders that we have. People don't consider that it could be a spectrum of different people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's categorizing into only two groups if you don't fit in.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to those people?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We talked about pay.
Mm-hmm. We talked about pay. So as a part of our system of socialization and now setting up dominant and non-dominant culture, we reinforce this through symbols. We readily this is my really poor drawing at 10 o'clock at night, but we readily identify this means a male and this means female, and those are the only two categories that we see right now on bathrooms. Okay. We'll skip sexual orientation because you all didn't put anything there. Okay, so tell me about what you put in age. And just say it out loud. Read it out loud.
Individuals age 60 or older are less likely to be offered a job interview.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the elderly don't have the opportunity to get a job
Mm-hmm.
as much as like a younger person would.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ability?
Disabled individuals less likely to be invited for a second in-person interview.
Mm-hmm.
So I think companies might think they're not competent. They can't do what a normal person can do.
Mm-hmm. An able-bodied individual could do, right? Okay.
When surgery is not offered for
Operable means it can be operated on. Mm-hmm.
Cancer treatment for patients of African descent. So, race.
Mm-hmm.
They're not allowed to get better
Mm-hmm.
just because of their race.
Mm-hmm.
And Facebook ads can be filtered to target ads based on profile, so stereotyping based on what you look like, determine maybe what you like based on that.
Mhm. Okay.
Extra security checks for airline flyers wearing religious attire. So basically, discriminating and having a stigma for someone who wears specific clothing based off their religion.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Wealthy individuals live on average of 5 to 10 years longer than non-wealthy individuals, so the health and how much money you have connects to that.
Mm-hmm.
Tax benefits extended based on marital status. I think that could also go sexual orientation.
Why?
I don't know how. It was a couple years ago. Then, homosexual people couldn't get tax benefits. I don't know if they still can.
I would agree with you that could belong in sexual orientation. You want to move it up there? Right. So there's a system of reward. If you identify as heterosexual and you enter into a heterosexual marriage that is defined as one man and one woman, we got to use that very clear language, then we're going to reward you for that. We're going to lower the amount of taxes that you pay every year. Okay? What about language?
Directional signs are written only in one language.
Mm-hmm.
So English would be, if you don't know English, that's a big disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
Patients with an accent speech are not given same information as other patients.
Mm-hmm.
So discriminating and
Mm-hmm.
based off of your language.
Mm-hmm.
And people with ethnic sounding names pay higher interest rates on loans. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so out of all of these things up here, what's surprising to you? So you said, I didn't realize or I didn't think that people with quote-unquote ethnic sounding names pay higher interest rates on loans. What else stands out to you as, I didn't really know that?
Like patients with
Go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay, patients with accents. Sorry. Patients with accents are not given the same information. So information is being withheld just because they don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know the surgery is not offered for cancer for patients with accents.
Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that all of these things happen all the time. What I am saying is that there's a lot of evidence been documented, has been published in lots of different journals and lots of different studies that have been done. I didn't just make these up. Literally, these things do happen. The impact then, what would you say then is the impact of having kind of this dominant and non-dominant cultural system set up?
Get out of it. It's like institutionalized with everything, so it would be very difficult to change that.
It's institutionalized. It's everywhere. You can't necessarily, like, you can't move to Iowa and escape it, right? It's not like just leaving a place and going to another place and escaping it. It's like the air we breathe. It's just always there.
It impacts really important things in your life, like your job or your health,
Mm-hmm.
which is like how you can survive.
Yeah.
And some of these things, like your race, you don't choose your race.
Right.
And like things like that.
Yeah. So the impacts of having this dominant and non-dominant culture can really impact how people survive. I heard you use the word survive, right? So it can really change how much money you make. It can change the quality of the health care that you get and how you're treated in the healthcare institution, right? And even around income, that individuals that are wealthy live 5 to 10 years longer than everybody else, just because they're wealthy. Just because they're wealthy. Okay. And I also heard you say, this stuff really ain't fair, right? I didn't choose my race. I didn't get a chance to choose my parents. I mean, or maybe I did, I don't know. But this is, I couldn't control how much melanin was in my skin. It's just how much melanin is in my skin. And because of that, Facebook might filter ads that show up on my Facebook profile. And this has been documented, and Facebook has been called out on this in particular because one of the things, Facebook makes money from advertisement. And so when you have companies or you have groups or organizations that want to do targeted advertising, let's say if there's a scholarship that you qualify for, right? We want to send you to college, or we want to send you to Johns Hopkins. And as an advertiser, I may filter that ad to only be displayed on profiles that are white, or where the person identifies as white. And there's a whole system of like metrics and things that Facebook does to understand some specific things about people's profiles. It's not just that we can do targeted ads, but it's that we can do ads that intentionally exclude other groups. So there's some things that you might qualify for. It could be a job announcement. It could be, you know, there's a new rental condo place that's opening up down the street from you, and we want to get the word out, but we don't want certain people living there. There's a way to continue to reinforce this because it is so embedded into who we are and what we do, and just the matter of just living in this world, in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so having said all that though, let's go back to, we have a choice. We can continue the status quo, and we can continue promoting the cycle of socialization by just doing nothing. We don't have to do anything. You can walk out of here today and nothing has to change, and that's okay. That's okay. Like I'm not making a judgment call. We can continue doing this, but we also understand how bad this is. It's not fair, and it affects people's ability to even just survive. All right? And it affects so many different things. Okay, make sense? We can choose to change things, however. We can choose to educate, to question, to reframe, to join an organization, to start our own advocacy group, to talk to our friends and our family members about what we understand about this whole cycle and how we identify in these different groups and how do we do things to kind of change this, okay? So I'm going to propose and say one of the ways that you can start a conversation about this cycle and about these different groups, you know, kind of the dominant, non-dominant culture, is through your Photo Voice project. You have a very powerful tool. We are visual beings, right? Whatever we can see, we process a lot of information really, really fast. A lot of it subconsciously, we don't even know we did it. And, you know, we make judgment calls all the time about the things that we see, particularly about our race, how much melanin is in our skin, right? Or what do we look like? How close our eyes are to one another. right? We make all kinds of judgment calls. So pictures literally tell a story, and they are worth 1,000 words, which is why I'm so stoked about your project. This is going to be great. Can you think about how you have been socialized? And you don't have to answer right now, but I want you to kind of keep that in your mind about how you have been socialized. And if there are any of these groups that you have been socialized to think a little more negatively about.
Islam
Mm-hmm.
recently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's been pretty prevalent in the media
Mm-hmm.
when shootings happen and things like that.
Yep.
People get wrong ideas. They're fearful, so
Yes.
they will automatically judge.
Yes. Yes. So you have been socialized, and that's been reinforced, especially lately, that individuals who identify in an Islamic religion are terrorists, and they're perpetrators of mass shootings, and they're bad people.
Another thing, I think, at least in our school, there's a few girls who wear the hijab and stuff, and they'll get misnamed a lot, or like you're this person, you're that person all the time. It's like they're not even an individual. They're just like, oh, a group of girls who wears the hijab.
What is that? What's happening?
Dehumanized.
They are being dehumanized. They have a name. Their parents or whomever gave them their name at birth, but they just get lumped together as a group. You're just a group of girls that wear hijabs, and we can't tell y'all apart. That's exactly what's happening, and you see it in your school. How you have been socialized and this system of dominant and non-dominant culture, and that gets reinforced in the media, influence the pictures that you're going to take?
What comes to mind right now is on CNN there was this interview with a woman who was wearing the hijab, but the hijab was in an American flag. So that's, I guess, a bit challenges the norm, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
this is an American, she loves America.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That, like maybe something that so with our photos project, something that challenges the norm.
Okay, so you might look for, in through your camera lens, you might be looking for images that you're going to take that challenge this dominant kind of cultural ideas. Okay. So I'll say for myself, if I've been socialized to think that along the lines of sexual orientation, that individuals that identify as something other than heterosexual, it's too bad, right? That's like a choice that you made. It was the wrong choice. And so I may not even pay attention to taking pictures of a bathroom sign, or I may not even pay attention to talking to somebody at my school or in my neighborhood or that I work with who identifies as being along a sexual orientation spectrum, right? Because a lot of this stuff is also unconscious, right? So I want you to keep that in mind. I want you to wrestle with, as you're looking at kind of whatever your focal point is and you're taking a picture, I do want you to think about this. And I do want you to think about, okay, I'm taking this picture because it challenges these ideas of dominant or non-dominant culture, or it perpetuates these ideas of dominant and non-dominant culture. You could take a picture of a bathroom sign and say, you know, I was socialized to think that sexual orientation or kind of this gender spectrum, that's not a bad thing if you're heterosexual. It's just the way that I was raised, and it's just what I believe. And so this is actually a symbol of equity. And it's okay to say that, because when we get all the pictures together and we're talking about what does it mean to you and the story that you're trying to tell, it is very much your voice, okay? So I want you to understand that's okay. Does that make sense? It's okay. I also want to challenge you to try to think about how do you communicate outside of your own voice to try to get the voice of other people in your pictures. All right? Okay. Have a seat. Thank you. It's very good, very good, very good wall work up there. All right. What do you see in this picture? So I heard like a tiger, heard an elephant, maybe like a toucan in there somewhere. Yeah. Your perspective really does make a difference, right? So if you're able to approach the pictures that you're taking through this lens of trying to capture what equity or inequity looks like from all of these different perspectives, you're going to have a really broad range of pictures. And we don't do that. So we say what you see mainly depends on what you look for, right? So I want you to be intentional about looking at these different groups and trying to capture these kinds of pictures to tell a story. So I want to talk with you now. This is more of the lecture part, which it's not my favorite part of the day, but it's more of the lecture part of the day, to talk about what a practical example of this impact of socialization and dominant culture has actually done in our city. All right, so I'm going to share and kind of briefly at this point, kind of this historical context about Nashville and specifically talk about North Nashville. In 2010, our health department was selected as one of a couple of local health departments around the country to participate in this racial healing project. So the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, the same people that make Kellogg cereal, and they're billionaires as well, their charitable foundation has really focused on how do we kind of undo a lot of this stuff, this unfair stuff that is really affecting how people survive and how they even live, the quality of life for even the time that they're alive, right? And so they've really focused on kind of these concepts around racial healing, that we have to be able to undo some of the damage that was done by colonization, and that's kind of the framework that they operate from. And we point to colonization, at least in the United States, as kind of the beginning of, in our American history, the beginning of the setting up of this kind of structure. That at least in the category of race, to your point exactly, that black men out of everybody else, unfortunately, have gotten probably the worst deal, right? Have been the most affected by kind of this system of colonization, and then black women have been affected as well. So in a historical context, if we talk about early Nashville, the first kind of people who arrived in Nashville, they came in about 1779, and they came from North Carolina. And the information that I'm sharing here is due in part because of the work that the team did in 2010 of kind of understanding what happened in North Nashville, like why does it look the way that it looks? Why do we see a large number of health disparities really concentrated in this area that's from Tennessee State University, Meharry, Fisk, that whole kind of Jefferson Street corridor. From a health department standpoint, when we look at health disparities, and I'm sure Dr. Alexander talked about this as well earlier this morning, is that we're trying to understand kind of why is there this concentration of kind of all this bad stuff in one area. And it's been that way for a while. And trying to understand how did it get that way, because it wasn't always like that. It was not always like that. So we start at the beginning. In the 1780, after kind of the first settlers arrived here from North Carolina, about 20% of what we called the black population back then were free people, right? So this is free to own, technically free to own land, free to move around Nashville without, well, there's still fear of being captured and, still being enslaved in the South, which continued for decades even after the Emancipation Proclamation. But for the most part, 20% of the black population was free. One of the things that started to set up even inequities in Nashville as early as 1780 is that the earliest white settlers from that first group that came from North Carolina in 1779, or their heirs, they were guaranteed 640 acres of land a family. So if you can imagine kind of Davidson County, Nashville, we'll just call it all of Middle Tennessee at this point, that if you were white and you moved to this area to settle it, to make something out of it, you were guaranteed 640 acres of land. Right there, land ownership set up a system of wealth in our city. And the people who had the first opportunity to develop wealth in our city were white people. That's not surprising. That happened in a lot of places, right? In the 1840s, so if we jump up, not quite 100 years later, just as the city starts to become more urbanized, we were starting to move into building a center city. We were labeled as one of the deadliest places to live, in part because we didn't have good sanitation. People died from things like tuberculosis. They died from, diseases, not malaria, but more like, having unsanitary water, right? So having our sewer, our waste being in the same place where we drink our water back then. 1862, Nashville became the first Southern capital to fall to the Union soldiers. So if you think about the impact of the Civil War, of course, the 13th Amendment was passed that abolished slavery. The same year that the 13th Amendment was passed, the Ku Klux Klan started in Pulaski, Tennessee. The 14th Amendment entitled all persons that were born in the United States to citizenship. Kind of jumping forward to 1877, Nashville was named the Black Athens of the South. So if you lived in the southern United States, Nashville was one of the places where you wanted to be. We did have a primarily free black population here, even though the KKK were just down the street in Pulaski. But it's kind of where you wanted to be as a black person to start kind of living out your American dream as a freed black person. Kind of makes sense? Y'all didn't know that Nashville was like the Black Athens of the South, did you? It's a pretty awesome city. 1945, so we're going to jump ahead again, not quite 100 years. If we think about Jefferson Street in North Nashville, this was the hub of African American life and African American business. We take a look at the 50s. We had great economic stability, so many of the locally owned businesses were self-sufficient, which meant by an economic measure, for every dollar that was spent in the community, the dollar came back, right? So if I worked at, let's say if I worked at Meharry Medical College at that time, if I was a nurse or I was a doctor, or I worked in the kitchen, or I cleaned the floors, I was a part of the cleaning crew, I spent my money in the same place where I lived. And for black people and black businesses, if I wanted to go to the grocery store, there was Otay grocery store. If you drive down Jefferson Street now, just before you get to, what is that, where Metro General is? Jefferson, and then if we're coming from the health department, Jefferson, and then you turn right to go to Metro General Hospital. I can't remember the name of the road right now, and my mind just blanked out. Maybe, yes, DB Todd, maybe. You'll see on the right-hand side, there's like an Otay shopping plaza, and it's O-T-E-Y. What we learned as a part of researching kind of the history of North Nashville, Otay was actually a family, and he we'll just say Daddy Otay, was the first black-owned grocery store in the city. And so where I lived, where I worked, and where I spent my money, North Nashville, for black people, was economically stable. That money stayed in the community, it was recycled in the community, and that's a pretty important economic indicator. We were resource rich, had lots of grocery stores, clothing stores. There's lots of social cohesion, so you knew who your neighbors were, you went to church with them, we got the social support that people need. If somebody was sick, we knew who was sick. We knew who we could go, needed to get to the doctor, or who needed food if they were having a crisis, those kinds of things. We had really good, we had adequate housing, it was safe. In terms of higher education, we had 3 institutions right down the street. You had Fisk University, you have Meharry Medical College, and you have Tennessee State University. 3 historically black colleges and universities all in the same area, right? Black Athens of the South. A couple of pictures that we were able to kind of dig through the archives and find. In that upper left-hand corner, it's a tiny picture, but that is Otay's Supermarket. So that's that grocery store that I was sharing with you earlier. We have a picture of down here, kind of the third picture down on the left. That's a structure that's near Hadley Park Community Center, or Hadley Park, which was a pretty prominent gathering place in North Nashville. To the right here, you see our, kind of black servicemen coming back from war. It was a beautiful, self-contained community that had low crime, had great housing, had access to healthcare resources, full-service grocery stores, and transportation. If we fast forward to 2010, and this was the year that we started paying attention, kind of looking at the history of North Nashville. At the time in 2010, North Nashville had the highest poverty rate in the city. There were only 2 full-service grocery stores in North Nashville, and there was a Kroger on Monroe, which is close to what we consider to be Germantown now, which has actually completely changed since gentrification has started. There were lack of invested resources. We had high crime, kind of fear and mistrust of neighbors. We had really high foreclosure rates in the North Nashville area, dilapidated housing stock. We have low high school graduation rates among the high schools, and we're thinking specifically like in the Pearl Cone area. And we have really persistent health disparities, including the highest infant mortality rate, death to cancer and diabetes, etc. What happened? We go from 1950s North Nashville to 2010 kind of North Nashville. It's really important to understand this cycle of socialization and the setting up of dominant and non-dominant culture. What happened in a really, really simple sense is that the idea around race in particular, and that individuals who are African American, there is still this persistent idea around an inferiority, right? So we get lumped together as the blacks over there, right? This kind of idea, the socialization that, blacks are not equal to whites, in a sense, sets up policy, race relations, environment, and then this other thing called war on drugs, right? So this all stems from this deep-rooted idea, this stigma about black people, and in particular about black men, that gets perpetuated in the media and so on and so forth. So if we go through just a couple of policies, and I'm going to jump a little bit, I'm kind of jump around a little bit. The Homeowners Loan Act of 1933. So in order for you to buy a house, most people buying a home is the biggest purchase that they're ever going to make in their life. It's a lot of money to buy a house. Most people need to secure a mortgage in order to buy a home. Remember when we talked about people with ethnic sounding names pay higher interest rates on loans? That really does happen. It can be completely subconscious, but there's this idea that if you're not white, then maybe your money's a little funny, as we say. Like you're more likely to default on your loan. That may or may not be true, but you're placed into a different risk category that, okay, you're more likely to default on your loan, so I'm going to charge you a highest interest rate. Or your loan application may not be looked at all, because you have a quote-unquote ethnic sounding name, okay? So for Homeowners Loan Act of 1933, this set up a different system that white people could get home loans to buy houses in the area. In particular, black people had a much, much harder time being able to do that. So just in a real simple sense. Certainly in our city, we went through, Nashville's civil rights movement. One of the quotes that I love that the group really started to talk about was a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he spoke at Nashville Fisk University saying, I came to Nashville not to bring inspiration, but to gain inspiration from the great movement that has taken place in this city. During the civil rights era, Nashville absolutely was a part of the civil rights movement in leading the country through our Nashville sit-ins that resulted in desegregating public places sooner than any other cities. One of the big things that we point to in kind of this destruction of this very prosperous Black community in North Nashville is Interstate 40. And the conversation about I-40, as we discovered, started way back in the 1930s about the creation of an interstate system. So once we've gone through, we've moved through the Industrial Revolution in our country. Most of our resources were concentrated in the urban center of the city at that time. And so you need to have a way, an interstate, as we say, to bring commerce from outside the center city to the center city, right? So if I have a manufacturing plant in downtown Nashville, I need to be able to get my materials from North Carolina to here. And we're on a river, so we rely on river transportation at that time. But to be able to say, if we had an interstate, then we can have trucks, we can have cars that can actually deliver our goods faster than being on the road. Well, where do we put an interstate section? We're going to put it right through the Black community, okay? So there's a big conversation in the local community, the leadership that argued that putting an interstate through the African American community would isolate those businesses from the clientele, and it would financially devastate the community. There was a big to-do around state attorneys that testified that there was no alternative route for the interstate. Like, this is the only way that we're going to be able to build this interstate, is it has to go right through the Black community. The committee of the local leaders, they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court saying, we don't want this, this is really going to devastate us. Unfortunately, they lost. And the construction of the interstate continued through 1960. Within a year of the construction project being complete, the majority of the businesses in the area had suffered financially. Many of them closed. You don't see Otay's supermarket there anymore. You see a shopping center now that's named the Otay's Shopping Center, but not the supermarket. The interstate literally cut the Black community in half. Streets were no longer connected to one another. You had to get on the interstate to go from here to get all the way over here. It decimated houses because you got to be able to build the interstate. So houses that were there, businesses that were there, were completely devastated. Many people were displaced out of their community, and those that could move did, which caused decreasing investment in the city. So this is, from Google. This isn't necessarily Google Maps, but this is what kind of North Nashville looked like. This is kind of the bend of the river here. What the community looked like. What I want you to pay attention to is in this area here, kind of this head of North Nashville, all of these streets are connected, right? There's no disruption in the community whatsoever. Everything is connected there. But when we build the interstate, so this is Google Maps now, and this is Interstate 40. So we tried to do an overlay of, this is a connected community in the 1950s. When the interstate comes in, you can see how it literally cuts the whole community in half. We lose businesses, we lose schools, we lose houses. We lose the sense of community. Again, this idea from the cycle of socialization that sets up this sense of dominant and non-dominant culture, this belief that Black people are inferior to white people, that drugs get introduced into communities. I won't go into all of the details. I encourage you to Google it yourself if you want to know a little bit more in-depth conversation around why inner cities were targeted during the 70s. But particularly heroin and cocaine were introduced to particularly communities of color all across the country. The 1970s is typically categorized as the rise of like the Black Panther Party. kind of this black power movement in the country. And coincidentally or not, drugs get introduced into those black communities when there appears to be this rise in power. When there's a sense of empowerment, the drugs got introduced. What do we say about the cycle of socialization? That it exists to kind of keep the dominant group in power, right? So when people start to move into, when non-dominant groups start to move into positions of power, we get scared because we think, I'm going to have to give up something that I have. I'm going to have to share something. I'm going to have to do without something that I have, and it's a human fear. Drugs get introduced. Then, once all these drugs get introduced into these black communities, what do? We create this policy and this whole social policy on the war on drugs. And the war on drugs, oh my gosh, led to this whole thing around mass incarceration. That we had, in terms of our U.S. population that was incarcerated in the 1920s, was less than 1%. And then as we move from the 1920s to 2008, the number of individuals, or the percentage of Americans, these are U.S. citizens, that are part of our population that were incarcerated, you can see how sharply it rises, okay? And very recently, as in the last year, a transcript was released from President Nixon's senior advisor. And this is a direct quote, and this quote was published in a newspaper article which you can read. But what I'll read to you is that, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Enforcement of the power structure in the cycle of socialization and a system of punishment that comes after that, right? So you have presidential, you have our president, Richard Nixon, his senior policy advisor, in a quote of a transcript that was released after he died. But to say that there actually, in a lot of communities, there weren't any drugs at all, they lied about it. They arrested many of the black leaders, and they arrested many of the leaders who were protesting the war in Vietnam. And that's a direct quote. This is the real damage. This is real damage that happens because of these ideas and how they get perpetuated. And these are real policies, and these are real things that happen as a part of our American history. And I don't say this to depress anybody, but I'm saying this so that you're aware of it. It's real. If you want to learn more, there's a really good documentary on Netflix, if you have Netflix, called 15th. It's about the 15th Amendment. Has anybody seen it? Heard about it? I've seen it. I encourage you to watch it. It's really good, but just take a look at it. If you want to know more, you can also you can Google the Harvard Implicit Bias Test. There's lots and lots of tests that the Implicit Bias Center has, but it just helps to reveal more about biases that you may have as an individual. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person if you have bias, it just means that you've been socialized in this way. And it's helping to raise that awareness. And there's another video that I like, it's on YouTube, called Kids on Race, The Hidden Picture. Anderson Cooper, at that time on CNN, worked with a group of child psychologists to document how soon in our development these ideas about race, when these dominant and non-dominant categories get set up in kids, kindergartners, just showing them pictures and asking them, what do you think is happening? And it's a really strong representation of how this socialization happens. All right, so it's all about how we look at our work. Are there 4 tubes or are there 3? Depends on how you look at it. What do you, how many do you see, Priya?
I saw both.
You saw both. Mm-hmm. You saw both. How would you communicate the fact that you see both? So you might be able to capture an image and describe to somebody how they could look at that image from two different perspectives, right? That if you look at it from the top, like if you turn your head at a 90-degree angle, you can see that there's 4, but then if you turn your head this way, you can see that there's 3, right? This can be a very powerful tool in how we're thinking about how we're communicating our pictures from our photo voice project, that we can capture two different perspectives at the same time. These are some pretty heavy concepts, right? And it's a pretty heavy load, or it can feel like a heavy load to move into that direction for how do we change the cycle of socialization. But a good first step is being able to have a conversation, right? So what I want you to walk away with today, the last things I want you to hear me say, are for your photo voice project, in the lens that you are looking through when you're taking your pictures, to think about these different categories and try to capture images that to you speak to, as you've said, right, either kind of challenge this idea of dominant versus non-dominant culture, or that reinforce it, and both are okay. The other thing I want you to hear, the last words that I'm going to say to you today are going to be around this Brene Brown video around empathy. What did you all think about that video? Yeah?
I realized that I was also the other, the wrong person in that, like, saying at least, like, I feel like I've said that too. I didn't realize that
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
exactly what they need personally.
Yes. So if you encounter, let's say, one of the girls at your school who wears a hijab, and, you know, she can say, you know, people keep calling me the wrong name, and it's not right or it's not fair. And you might be tempted to sympathize with her and say, well, at least you're at Hume Fogg. I mean, like, you know, if you were at another school, it could be a lot worse. As opposed to saying, yeah, that really does suck. And I'm really sorry that you're going through that. And you might figure out how to take it a step further and say, what can I do to help? Right? That's a real simple way every single day that we can start to make changes, poking holes in this whole cycle of socialization. Make sense? All right. Last words, destiny is not a matter of chance, it is a matter of choice. It is not to be waited for, it is a thing to be achieved. It's a great quote from William Jennings Bryan. There's a lot of, you know, in public health, there's a lot of kind of quotes around, I will say, your generation, right? You're going to be the first generation in history to not smoke. You're going to be the first generation in history to not do a lot of things. We have high hopes for you. My high hope for you, this is no pressure, by the way. You have allies and the rest of us in the room, and lots of people who are like us. To be one of the first generations in history to take a poke at that, to dismantling this, to calling it out every time you see it, whenever you're aware of it, and not being afraid to do it. Okay? You can contact me at any time. Miss Tish has my email, but you can email me, you can call me anytime you want to hang out, you have more questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about what you learned today. And I will tell you, I am so excited to see your pictures and what you're going to do with this project. In any way that I can support you, I'm going to do it. You got me. Yes, indeed. Thank you. It's good work.